Grandpa Portman picked me up from school that afternoon, as he often did when both of my parents were working. I climbed into a passenger seat of his old Pontiac and declared that I didn't believe in his fairy stories anymore. "What fairy stories?" he said, peering me over his glasses. "You know, the stories about the kids and the monsters." He seemed confused. "Who said anything about fairies?" I told him that a made-up story and fairy tales were the same thing, and that the fairy tales were for pants-fitting babies, and that I knew that his old photos and stories were fakes. I expected him to get mad or put up a fight, but instead he just said, "Okay," and threw a Pontiac into a drive. With a step of his foot on the accelerator, we lurched away from the curb, and that was the end of it. I guess he just seen it coming, and that I had to grow out of them eventually, but he dropped the whole thing so quickly that left me feeling that I'd been lied too. I couldn't understand that he'd made up all that stuff, tricked me into believing that extraordinary things were possible when they weren't. It wasn't until a few years later my dad explained me that Grandpa told him some of the same stories when he was a kid. And they weren't lies, exactly, but exaggerated versions of truth, because the story of Grandpa Portman's childhood wasn't a fairy tale at all. It was a horror story. My grandfather was the only member of his family to escape Poland before the Second World War broke out. He was 12 years old when his parents sent him into arms of strangers, putting their youngest son on a train to Britain with nothing more than a suitcase and clothes on his back. It was a one-way ticket, and he never saw his mother or father again, his older brothers, cousins, aunts, and uncles. Each one would be probably dead before his 16th birthday, killed by monsters that he had so narrowly escaped. And it weren't the kind of monsters who had tentacles and rotten skin. It were the kind that a 7-year-old might be able to wrap his mind around. They were monsters with human faces, in crisp uniforms, marching in lockstep. It's so banal that you can't recognize them from who they are until it's too late. Like the monsters and the Enchanted Island story were also true in disguise, comparing to the horrors of mainland Europe. The children's house that had taken my grandfather must have seemed like paradise, and so in the stories it had become one. The safe haven of endless summers, guardian angels, and magical children who couldn't really fly, turn invisible, or lift boulders, of course. The peculiarity for which they'd been hunted was simply their Jewishness. They were orphans of war, washed up on that little island in the tide of blood. What made them amazing wasn't that they had miraculous powers. That they escaped ghettos and gas chambers was a miracle enough. I stopped asking my grandfather to tell me stories, and I think secretly he was relieved. And the air of mystery closed around the details of his early life. I didn't pry. He'd been for hell, and he'd right to his own secrets. I felt ashamed for being jealous of his life, considering the price he'd paid for it, and I tried to feel lucky for my safe and unextraordinary one, but I had done nothing to deserve. But then, a few years later, when I was 15, extraordinary and terrible thing happened, and there was only before and after.